Prolonged Dissolution of the USSR. Today, on February 22nd, 2 years after Russia's full invasion of Ukraine, we are bringing you a panel of leading scholars who will share their views on the big question of whether, to what extent, Russia's war against Ukraine and other ongoing conflicts over sovereignty in the former Soviet region are the consequences or manifestations of an extended dissolution of the Soviet Empire. The panel's expert moderator is Julie George from Queens College in the US, who is also part of the leadership team of the ESN as treasurer, also special issues editor of Nationalities Papers, and a political scientist whose research has focused on the politics of state building, ethnicity, democratization, and secession in the post-communist region, particularly in the Caucasus, one of the regions where sovereignty conflicts have continued after 1991. Julie and I have been planning this conversation together, and I'm delighted to give the virtual floor over to Julie so she can introduce this panel in a more substantive way and introduce the speakers and moderate the conversation. Over to you, Julie.
Thank you so much, Yuja. Thank you for that very nice introduction. This has indeed been a panel that we have been thinking about now since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and something that I've been thinking about for a while in terms of how we understood the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s. And it was often framed as a peaceful dissolution. And I think now that kind of framing is probably, it deserves a rethinking. As someone who does work in the Caucasus, I do have to say that my experience of it has never been a non-conflictual or a non-violent dissolution. But I think that often, you know, the countries in the so-called periphery and the conflicts that are there are thought of as something outside that framework as opposed to part of this larger structure. And I think that thinking comes across now after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine with our conversations about decolonization in a very sort of interesting kind of way. What does it mean for an empire to collapse? What does it mean to have imperial control? How do we understand empire in this context? And I think this is, of course, something that the field has been discussing at ACES with a recent theme of decolonization. And this year it's going to be liberation. And it is something that we do struggle at ASN with a great deal because of our emphasis on nationalities and how those nationalities politics have engendered a variety of different sorts of responses. And it's harder to fit those nationalities into a strong thematic structure of peaceful dissolution. That's all I'm going to say now, because I think our three panelists are going to give us a variety of different contexts and come from a variety of different perspectives with their own research and their own understanding of this question. I'm sure we all know who they are, but I'm going to introduce them all now very briefly, and then I'm going to give the floor to our first speaker. Marlene Laruelle will speak first. She is the director and research professor at the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at the Elliott School at the George Washington University. I think in the chat, we will be posting the full bios. I'm going to go through them quickly so we can have more time for talking and more time for Q&A. We're also joined by Mark Beissinger, who is the Henry W. Putnam Professor at the Department of Politics at Princeton University. Our final panelist and speaker will be Peter Rutland, who is professor of government at Wesleyan University and is a vice president at the Association for the Study of Nationalities. Without further ado, Marlene, I'm going to give the floor to you. So welcome and thank you.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation for this really very important topic. I will begin, in fact, launching the discussion by looking at something that is maybe more internal to Russian society, but which I think is really important for us when we want to understand the role of Russia in the world region, which is to look at Russian society's perception of the Soviet Union, because it's a very multifaceted legacy with very different meanings, and trying to disentangle these different meanings of what was Sovietness can also help us understanding the support, or at least the passive acceptance by the Russian society of the war. And as you were mentioning in the introduction, Julie, there was already a lot of discussion about, you know, the fact that we tend to overuse the term post-Soviet without very clearly defining what do we still consider as being post-Soviet, or should we move toward other notion. And so I think it's interesting when we look at the Russian society to try to precisely capture what is still a kind of heavy legacy of the Soviet Union and what has been transformed. And one of the ways that is usually talked about is to discuss nostalgia for the Soviet regime, or for the Soviet Union, should I say. But nostalgia, it can be a more affective state than something that is intellectually constructed or politically salient. I think in the Russian case, it is also politically salient, but I think it's important to try to remember that nostalgia is usually something which relates more to a kind of a affective state. And so when we look at the surveys we have on nostalgia for the Soviet Union, we can see that, of course, it was very high in the 90s. And then it began falling down around 2004 up to 2012, where it was at about like 50% of the population still feeling some form of nostalgia for the Soviet Union. And then it rose again to 60 to 70%, depending on the survey of the year. So we are now at a par with the 90s, which is, I think, telling us a lot about maybe not so much what people remember of the Soviet Union, but what do they feel about what Russia has become today. Of course, old people tend to be more nostalgic about the Soviet Union, but we have seen also this nostalgia being at least demonstrated in a discursive way during survey by people who haven't experienced the Soviet Union, which is a very classic phenomenon of nostalgia for a time of a place you have never been. So what are the elements of this Soviet legacy that are meaningful today and that are kind of showing at the societal level this kind of prolonged dissolution of the Soviet Union? I think the first one we think about is the great power status. And in 2022, there was a series of focus groups done in different cities of Russia, so after February 24, where people were asked to project the future they wanted for Russia in 10 or 20 years. And when you look at this focus group, their vision of Russia, and it was really average citizen, was very much close to a kind of, you know, European-style social democracy, you know, welfare state, education, individual right respected, private property, plus great power. So great power was really the core element that would dissociate this kind of Russian focus group of thinking about the future from a European focus group. And then an element that is, of course, associated to that is the relationship to the territory of the former Union as well as to the territory of Russia itself. And that's where all the discussion about Russia, the nation state, Russia, the post-empire, neo-empire, post-colonial, neo-colonial, there is a lot of terminology floating around, is kind of becoming really important. And here also, there was a fascinating surveys, and of course we can discuss about the values of this survey done in the war context in Russia about which territory do you think belongs to Russia. It was done like a few months ago in the fall 2023. And what was really fascinating was to see that you have about 2/3 of Russian for whom Chechnya, Dagestan, and Tatarstan don't belong to Russia. Same level of those who considered that, 1/3 of Russian surveyed considering Chechnya, Dagestan, and Tatarstan do not belong to Russia, same level as Lugansk and Donetsk, right? So about 2/3 considering both Lugansk and Donetsk and North Caucasus belong to Russia, 1/3 considering no. So that's a really interesting kind of, I think, illustration of this thinking that were already very much there in the 90s, that some part of Russia are not very Russian, while some part of territory that are outside Russia, mostly Ukraine, less Georgia, are seen as Russian. And so the survey was really also interestingly looking at, you know, which territory resonate more or less. For example, Zaporozhye, Kherson, South Ossetia, Transnistria, Abkhazia resonate less than Donetsk and Lugansk. And at the question about Ukraine as a whole, there was about 1/4 of respondents thinking that Ukraine is part of Russia. So I found that interesting to look at how the population is still having difficulties accepting Russia in its international border and considering that what is outside should stay outside, what is inside should be considered as part of the nation. And I think that is, we see the same kind of repetition of the Soviet kind of matryoshka construction of national identity that was in fact inherited from Stalinist time. It's really a kind of national Bolshevik construction from the 30s and 40s, with Russian at the ethnic Russian at the center of this multinational construction, and the other groups functioning in a kind of concentric circles, with some of these concentric circles not overlapping what are the legal internationally recognized border of Russia. Another, I think, element of this kind of prolonged dissolution of the Soviet Union is the relationship to everything that would be politically connected to the Soviet Union. And one of the, I think, interesting elements is to look at what is happening among younger part of the Russian population, where you can see a rise of leftist positioning, something that was not there anymore in the 2000s, and that is kind of now re-emerging. If you look at the Communist Party, a new member, that are people who are often closely to kind of European social democracy than to a hardline Stalinism, as you can find among older generation. And here also there was a very good survey done in November 2022 to young people about their political orientation, and those who identified politically, which is a minority in itself. Among that minority, the majority were identifying themselves as leftist, communist, social democrat, anarchist, and only 9% were identifying as conservative, which I found is an interesting element in, if we think about the language of the state, about conservatism and traditional values. Something where I also see a very strong legacy of the Soviet Union is related to economics, relationship to the private sector, to the idea that the state should be the redistributing force, that nationalization of big enterprise is something that is largely seen positively, with the oligarchs really playing the kind of the bad guy. But at the same time, you still have a very strong support for private property and a consumerist society. So I think here we can see what is the legacy of Soviet regime, and which is in fact largely also a kind of European social democratic vision of the role of the state, but keeping the kind of consumerist society. That is something that arrived, that is a very post-Soviet feature, but that I think is really considered now as something that people want to keep. And my last point is about the more kind of cultural, societal element of Sovietness that have remained. If we ask people in survey about what are they missing from Soviet time, of course, many people are mentioning predictability and stability, but they are also mentioning, solidarity, feeling cozy, being less egoist, being more optimistic. So there are also kind of human feelings that are part of this reconstruction of this kind of now mythified Soviet golden age. And for me, something that I am really trying to comprehend in a more complex way is this call for a social order. And I think it's important for us to remember how much the Soviet society was also a very conservative society in terms of more. It was a very prude society. It was already used to denounce the West as a immoral West, maybe because of capitalism, not because of LGBT rights, but we can see that all this legacy of the West as immoral and of a conservative society is also paradoxically a legacy of the Soviet Union. And when we look here also at survey, it's interesting to notice how much, in fact, a large part of the population, around 2/3, is supporting all the state patriotic military education initiative at school and outside school. So there is really this kind of call for a kind of social order. I think the regime interprets that as a call for a state ideology. I think it's more complex than that. I think the population is interested by a kind of stable social order, not necessarily a non-doctrinating state ideology, even if just before the war in 2021, we organized with Norwegian colleagues a survey asking people if they wanted to see a state ideology officialized, and there was here also more than 3/4 of the people saying they were favoring a state ideology. So I think it's an important element to try to interpret this quest for social order that I think is a very grassroots phenomenon. It's coming from the bottom, but it has, of course, it's totally instrumentalized by the regime under in the form of a new state ideology and kind of traditional values promotion, and Russia as a unique civilization. So I think there are both all these ideological elements that are both something coming from a grassroots domain and meeting a top-down regime survival strategy that also shows that this dissolution of the Soviet Union takes a lot of time for the Russian society to digest, both because the regime is slowing down, of course, the moving away from the Soviet legacy, but also because for part of the society is still seen as a kind of normative framework that is seen with nostalgia, but here also with some nuances, right? I think we don't want to enter a narrative where we would see the Russian society as not having evolved at all and still being very much in a Soviet framework, while the rest of the post-Soviet space would have evolved. I think it's much more mixed. But of course, for Russian and globally, I think the Soviet Union appear and has been cultivated at this kind of golden age, and that plays, of course, a role on the impact of this prolonged dissolution of the Soviet Union on the whole region. And Mark will be continuing on that, so I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marlene. Mark, I'm going to turn the floor over to you for you to pick up on that, the more geopolitical perspective, the external perspective. So thank you.
Thanks, Julie. So I'll focus on the war in Ukraine, if it can be viewed, within the lens of the collapse of the Soviet Union to some extent, the continuing effects of the collapse of the Soviet Union, what we might mean by that. So, there's a general problem of overland empires. This is not just a problem of the Soviet Union. It's how do you define the boundaries of your empire when it collapses? It's a much more severe problem for overland empires than it was for overseas empires, largely because of the distance. Proximity breeds some desires to try to reassert. But it's not just proximity. There's also the problem of identity and so on. So it's not surprising that the collapse of the Soviet Empire is in some ways still with us. But I should say that even in Europe, where there were mainly overland empires, there's still a significant nostalgia for overseas empires. And in fact, there was an interesting survey that was done by YouGov in 2019 that was, in many European countries, and it showed very significant nostalgia. For some reason, I don't know why, the Dutch really do like the history of their empire. They had something like 42% of society showing a nostalgia for the Dutch Empire. Not that it was such a great empire, but nevertheless shows you that the size of empire is not necessarily associated with nostalgia. So there is, of course, a way in which Russia's 22 invasion was more closely related to the pre-Soviet past than it was to its Soviet legacy. Putin now claims the territories of southern and eastern Ukraine in what he calls Novorossiya. And as we know, Novorossiya was not a Soviet territory. It was a territory of the Tsarist Empire. In February 2022, the invasion was justified by Putin, not by the fact that these were Soviet territories that he was claiming, but rather that they were Tsarist territories. And we also know that Moscow attempted to invade Kiev. It attempted to overthrow the government of Ukraine. There was talk in Moscow of creating a puppet state, a Malorossiya. And Malorossiya is also a 19th century Tsarist term. And if you look at some of the maps that were floated around at the time of the invasion, including some by Dmitry Medvedev, they still tend to float around. The only part of Ukraine that was to be left, the only part of Ukraine that was to be left independent was Western Ukraine. which of course was part of the Soviet Union, but not part of the Tsarist Empire. So there is a way in which sort of, pre-Soviet understandings have really profoundly affected the nature of the Russian war and the Russian imperial enterprise. And yes, there are plenty of Soviet symbols that float around in the war. People plant Soviet flags, Russian soldiers plant Soviet flags on places, and the hammer and sickle is around. But I would say that in some ways that's more like a dog, marking its territory by urinating on it than indicating Sovietism per se. That is, there's a great eclecticism of symbols right now in Russia. There is, of course, it is a denial on the part of the Soviet Union, the part of the contemporary Russian government, that Ukraine even is an independent entity, and that Ukrainians are a separate people. And even in Russia now, there are suggestions, that to get rid of the term Rossiyski and to supplant it with the term Ruski. So there is a way in which, a lot of this goes back to earlier times. In many ways, this 2022 invasion broke with long-standing models of Soviet imperialism. It actually emboldened a more openly imperial vision, akin to the 19th century. One of the reasons why all of that imagery is there and all of that rhetoric. That doesn't mean that it wasn't related to the continuing consequences of the breakdown of the Soviet state in 1991. But what I think it actually reflects is the failure of Russian attempts at asserting informal control over the post-Soviet region along the Soviet model in the wake of the breakdown of the USSR and the embrace of a more openly imperial model associated with that. And that's what I want to talk about a little bit. So since 1991, there has been a strong relationship between challenges to Muscovite power and actually even before 1991, since the late 1980s, challenges to Muscovite power and the wars that unfolded in the Eurasian region. So most of the violent ethnic wars that emerged as the Soviet Union fell apart occurred as a consequence of the contraction of Muscovite control over the republics and the waves of nationalism that stimulated and provoked into being. And that generally empowered majorities and disempowered minorities within the units of the ethno-federal system. And minorities, disempowered minorities, looked to Moscow for protection. And here I'm talking about cases like Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Transnistria, but even others that never broke out into violent conflict, like, for instance, Crimea and Russian-speaking minorities in Estonia and Latvia. So a key element of these conflicts in the late Soviet period was the way in which Moscow tried to instrumentalize them. It tried to instrumentalize them in a failed attempt to hold the Soviet Union together, to pressurize the Union republics to remain within the USSR. Now, obviously, that effort failed, but that same kind of instrumentalization of ethnic conflict in an attempt to assert informal control over the region continued after the Soviet collapse. So Andronik Migranyan, who was a member of Yeltsin's presidential council, wrote in the mid-1990s that Yeltsin's government had initially drawn the, quote, strategically erroneous conclusion that Russia should turn inward, get out of all the former USSR republics and not interfere in the interethnic and regional conflicts in the former Soviet Union, openly and publicly renouncing any special rights and interests in the region. But he said that Moscow realized that that was wrong and that it deserved a special role in the post-Soviet space. And that's what Russian policy basically has been about, asserting that great power role, that regional great power role and control informal control over the post-Soviet states. So the strategy of informal empire that Russia pursued across the post-Soviet states from the mid-1990s onward, up through the mid-2010s, which many have written about, and I've written about it, but many others have written about it. that paralleled in some ways Soviet mentalities about how one goes about asserting power. You utilize the language of self-determination, you utilize sovereignty as a frame, a technology of control in some ways. And the Soviet Union mastered this technique. And this mentality, I think, continued after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Much like Eastern Europe during the communist period, newly independent republics would remain sovereign states, but they would be tied to Moscow through treaties that limited their independence in foreign and economic affairs, as well as their independence to establish a liberal democracy, which Moscow increasingly saw as being threatening to it. So that was a kind of neo-imperial or informal imperial project rather than an openly imperial one. And I think here's where, the question that we were asked to focus on really comes into focus. And that is Russia's invasion of Ukraine part of a continuing process of the dissolution of the USSR? And I think the answer is yes. To me, it represents the failure of that post-Soviet neo-imperial model, even as Russian aspirations to empire were rising within Russia. That led to Russia's invasions of Ukraine. So over time, Russian informal control over the region has been contracting, not only in Ukraine, but also in Transcaucasia, in Central Asia, in Moldova. It really only has one firm ally left, and that's Belarus, cemented to Russia largely because of the domestic threat to the Lukashenko regime. But the attractions of Europe and China are simply just too strong for Russia to compete as an informal empire. And now, in the case of Ukraine, Russia invaded Crimea in 2014 in direct response to its loss of informal control over Ukraine in the wake of the Euromaidan revolution. So Russia's neo-imperial ambitions in Ukraine, which revolved around control over Ukraine through energy, through tying the Ukrainian political elite to Russia, to penetrating the Yanukovych regime, which it did, pretty well. Those efforts failed because that regime was overthrown, and Ukraine tilted heavily towards Europe. And in this respect, the annexation of Crimea represented a break. It represented a break with the neo-imperial model that had predominated up until that time, and the embrace of a more openly imperial model based on conquest rather than neo-imperial control. But the elements of that neo-imperial model still remained. It didn't disappear. And the proxy war that Russia engaged in Donbass largely had the purpose of trying to force Kiev to accept an internal structure, a federal structure that would allow Russia to exercise leverage over Ukraine, over Ukrainian affairs. So that, in some ways, represented a kind of, typical post-Soviet instrumentalization of ethnic conflict. Things began to turn around 2018, I would say. And around that time, which is when Ukraine was embracing a constitutional amendment calling for Ukraine to pursue NATO and EU membership, you start to see a proliferation of statements in the Russian press about the artificiality of the Ukrainian state and about supposed Ukrainian acts of genocide in the Donbass. And I have a student who's actually tracing this shift in Russian rhetoric, and he basically puts it in this 2018-2019 tipping point. So around that time, Russia seems to have abandoned, at least with respect to Ukraine, this neo-imperial model, and to have embraced a more openly imperial model of conquest and annexation. And here I think, prospect theory has a lot to tell us as a kind of theoretical handle on the nature of this embrace. So it tells us that people are more willing to take risks when faced with the prospect of loss than the prospect of gains. And I think that's exactly why you see such a risk-taking Putin in terms of invasion of Ukraine. It's not the prospect of gains. He sees it as the prospect of losses, which makes him much more risk-taking. So as you know, Zelensky was elected in 2019 with the promise of resolving Donbass through negotiation. But by that time, the Kremlin didn't want to have anything to do with that. They did meet in Paris. They met in Paris, briefly, and then, Putin refused to continue those meetings. He didn't want to negotiate it. And Zelensky had come to power, with the promise of trying to negotiate a solution to the Donbass situation. So around that same time, that the FSB began to expand its clandestine agents in Kiev. So those agents rose from 30 to 160, as we now know. So it was implanting the apparatus that it would use for invasion. And it suggests that, although maybe the decision to actually start the invasion didn't happen then, the preparations for it were already beginning back then. Zelensky made lots of peace overtures. He even withdrew some of the troops from Donbass. But again, he was not being responded to. And it was around this time also that Zelensky, who initially opposed NATO membership, switched and began to advocate in 2020, NATO membership for Ukraine. So very shortly after that, Russia really began the real preparation, which revolved around the troop movements and the placing of caches of weapons close to the border and so on. So that began already at the beginning. So to answer, the question that Shuja and Julie sort of put to us, the current war in Ukraine should be understood as part of a larger process of imperial breakdown created by the collapse of the Soviet Union, but it also should be understood as the failure of, in some ways, the informal sort of Soviet-type model, the failure of that model of control, and the shift of Russia towards a more openly imperial model.
Thank you, Mark, very much. Peter Rutland is our final speaker, and he has prepared a PowerPoint, which he's going to share with us. It has some delightful images. And so, Peter, I'm going to give you the floor.
Okay, thank you, Julie. And it's a hard act to follow, Mark Beissinger and Marlene Laruelle, and I'll try not to duplicate any of the points they made, and I'll try to react and build on some of their comments. It's been a very tough week for students of Russia and the former Soviet Union with the death of Alexei Navalny. So that was, on the one hand, very predictable, not surprising, but still incredibly shocking and gloom-inducing development. So I'll just fill in some of the background here. I think these quotes are familiar to all of us, but it's worth revisiting them at this particular point in history, that in 2005, when Putin was still kind of interested in cooperating with the West, he said famously the collapse of the Soviet Union was the major geopolitical disaster of the century. There's some debate about how to translate that, because of course in Russian there's no indefinite article. So should we say was a major geopolitical disaster or the major geopolitical disaster? I prefer to go with the definitive, the disaster, from the context of his speech. And then in the same year, an interview with German TV, he said, "He who does not regret the Soviet collapse has no heart. Who thinks can be brought back has no head." And I think, despite the fact that Russian policy has evolved since 2005, I think that is both of those comments are still kind of pretty central to Putin's worldview in some fundamental way. Now, last week, or whenever it was, in the February 16th, February 9th interview with Tucker Carlson, one of the few interesting things to come out of that 2 hours of time-wasting fawning over Mr. Putin was, at one point, Putin, talking about the dissolution of the Soviet Union, said the Russian leadership was to blame. Not mentioning Yeltsin by name, but I interpreted him as talking about Yeltsin, the Russian Federation leadership, along with the leadership of Ukraine and Belarusia, undermining Gorbachev, which I think is consistent with Putin's view that the Soviet Union could have been preserved and it was betrayed by the leaders, both by Gorbachev and by Yeltsin. Now, later on in the Tucker Carlson interview, Putin did mention Yeltsin by name and praised him for kind of standing up against NATO expansion and against the bombing of Yugoslavia. So that was quite interesting. Marlene mentioned some of this survey data already. It is rather depressing to see the extent to which Putin's attitude towards the former Soviet Union seems to be echoed in the Russian population. So a Levada survey asked people whether they had favorable or unfavorable attitudes towards these former Soviet leaders. And Brezhnev was by far the most positive-oriented leader. So this is very much that nostalgia for perceived stability of the Brezhnev era, 1964 to 82, when the Soviet Union was also at the peak of its superpower status, at least until the invasion of Afghanistan. And Gorbachev and Yeltsin are very strongly disliked because of the political chaos and economic collapse, which people associate with both the perestroika and the wild 1990s. So it's all about comparisons. So in comparison to what came next, the Soviet Union looks good. And echoing, I think, a point that Marlene made, when people are looking back at the Soviet Union, they're not conducting an exercise in history, right? They're not academics like us. They're expressing views about the present. It's much more a commentary on their present experience than on what they understood their past experience to have been collectively. Similarly, in this fairly new book by Charles Sullivan, Motherland, he goes into some detail about these different dimensions of the Soviet nostalgia, and he quotes the 2012 Levada survey, where people were asked directly, do you regret the collapse of the Soviet Union? And 58% said yes, and only 25% said no. And even more shockingly, to some extent disagreeing with President Putin, 40% of them would have liked to see it restored. So they're acting on their heart rather than their head, I guess. And one interesting point from Sullivan, he uses both surveys, but also some focus groups, I think mostly done back in 2012. And he found from talking to people that they weren't just getting the Soviet nostalgia from the TV and from the school textbooks. They were actually quite suspicious of the messages from the TV and the school textbooks, which he studied, he thought were quite balanced. And so this Soviet nostalgia was coming from this resentment of the economic privation of the 1990s. It was coming from failure of public services under Putin and nostalgia for the public services perceived under the Soviet Union. So it wasn't just that people were being spoon-fed propaganda by the Putin state. I mean, the Putin state was certainly trying to spoon-feed Soviet nostalgia propaganda, but people weren't necessarily getting their views from the state media. Looking at Stalin specifically, we see this, as Marlene mentioned, it kind of goes down and comes back up again over time. On the question of survey data, I just wanted to mention this unfortunate truth. I think that in wanting to show respect for the courage of Navalny, we shouldn't forget that his public approval and support rating was pretty low, and shockingly large numbers of Russians believe that his imprisonment was fair. They even believe that he wasn't really poisoned in 2020, and so on and so forth. And even among the youngest age group, the approval rating is only around 34%. So yes, young people are more interested in a different future for Russia, but it's still apparently a minority position. Moving into the more analytical kind of frame, we talk about the Soviet Union collapsing, but to some extent, to play a devil's advocate, what did collapse when the Soviet Union collapsed? Not everything collapsed. So one minor point, which I keep making, but nobody seems particularly interested in it, is this point about the legal status of the Soviet Union as a continuation state, not a successor state. So they made this distinction, a distinction which I think in international law had never been made before, but they're not like the Czechoslovakia going into two states or Yugoslavia. They claim to be the continuation of the Soviet Union. And if that's got something to do with the seat at the UN Security Council or whatever. More specifically, yes, some Soviet institutions collapsed and vanished without trace, including the Communist Party of the Soviet Union as a ruling entity. But a lot of Soviet institutions pretty much continued business as usual. And obviously the centralization of power in the Kremlin, which was asserted in the 1993 confrontation with the parliament, the Soviet army became the army of the Russian Federation, the KGB. Those institutions continued pretty much business as usual, albeit with smaller budgets and smaller personnel. And the whole infrastructure of the oil and gas industry, which had been built up during the Brezhnev era, a lot of it exporting to Europe over 30 years of infrastructural investment, that didn't disappear overnight either. And again, it's a trivial point maybe to make these observations, but it's not trivial in the sense of looking at the war in Ukraine. Why is the Russian army grinding on? It's because they inherited thousands of tanks and millions of shells from the Soviet period sitting in warehouses. They also inherited an industrial structure that was built around a lot of spare capacity that could be ramped up, so they can produce 10 times as many artillery shells as Europe or America can, because our defense infrastructure was not built around massive spare capacity for all-out war. And also, of course, the nuclear arsenal and the threat of using nuclear weapons, which Putin made a lot of in the opening weeks of the Ukraine war to deter Western boots on the ground. That also is obviously a very, very direct Soviet legacy. And moving on, I think Mark Beissinger very clearly laid out why it's much more a Tsarist state empire legacy than a Soviet legacy, although it's got elements of the Soviet period woven in. A lot of the baseline for Putin does seem to be a pre-1917 state legacy. So the Tsarist empire dissolved, the Soviet empire dissolved, but there are components of that state and just the real estate which it controls and aspires to control, which are still unchanging. And this reminds me of a debate in the 1950s that comes out of George Orwell's writings as well, and was debated by the Captive Nations folks in the late 1950s. Is the problem with Moscow, is the problem Soviet ideology, totalitarianism, which I think Orwell thought it was a universal ideology which could appear anywhere and was a universal threat? Or is the problem Russia? Is the problem unique in space, time, and culture and history to Russia itself? And that debate, we kind of assumed with the collapse of the Soviet Union, that debate went away. The Soviet Union's gone, so the Russia threat is gone. So we're turning over a new leaf. But now we're back in that debate about maybe the problem is Russia itself, even though the Soviet ideology is gone. The Russian state with its vast territory has not gone. And so this I think, this territorial configuration worldview is what is motivating Putin. In reacting to some of Mark Beissinger's comments, I would say, yes, I totally agree with this informal empire model. I think it's a very fruitful model that you've presented there, using proxies and intermediaries. That we see that within Russia, in Chechnya, as well as in Belarus and in other countries, maybe in Georgia. Maybe Julie can talk about how this model applies to Georgia today. I think that's a very useful way of looking at it. And of course, there was the debate about soft power, which ended up going nowhere. But I think that soft power debate also gets into this problem of a failed strategy of Russia to try to exert influence over what they used to call, but stopped calling, the near abroad. And with the failure of that, as Mark laid out, meant that they went back to kind of plan A, which is conquest. The question of boundaries, yes, it's kind of fuzzy with a land empire. Belarus, I assume, is in. Ukraine, they're fighting over. And it's hard to predict, right? One element of this is the unpredictability, that you don't know whether Putin will wake up one day and think that the Baltics are also historic Russian territory with Russian speakers, or northern Kazakhstan, right? We simply don't know. Anything is up for grabs after the shock of the invasion of Ukraine. And once the toothpaste is out of the tube, it's kind of very hard to create boundaries when Putin has basically, by attacking Ukraine, has announced that there are no fixed boundaries recognized in international law. So I'll stop at that point and hand over the screen to the organizers.
Thank you so much, Peter. You kind of asked me a question in the course of your talk, and so I guess as chair's prerogative, I can decide to answer it as I see fit or not. On the Georgia point, and it is a question I think is interesting. Those republics or former republics outside of the Ukrainian condition that have also experienced overt Russian aggression. One of them is in Georgia, and I was taken by Mark's point, where you can actually time the language. And of course, the Georgia War happened, a good decade before that timing, and so it does bring to question the extent to which the strategic language, the narratives that are used to rationalize and explain the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the extent to which those were actually actualized prior. It seems to me that they weren't. Like the Georgian invasion was more of an opportunity that was seized than part of it was much more tactical, I think, in my interpretation, than a strategic vision. But certainly the language and the mechanism, right, when we see the separatists, the encouragement of separatism in Eastern Ukraine and Donbass, that then I think it turns from a tactical decision into a much more strategic sort of framework. I have many questions, but and I am taking chair's prerogative a little bit here, but I wanted to come back to an insight that Mark gave and that Peter repeated, and that Marlene's findings support in a way. And that is that the narrative that I understand from your presentations combined with this novel moment of here is Vladimir to Putin trying to rebuild the Russian Empire with the strategies and the tactics learned by the Soviets, right? So it's the Soviet, it's Soviet in action, but Russian in mentality, to borrow, I guess, Lenin. I want to know how much of it is Putin. So much of the language, Peter's talking about Putin, Marlene is speaking about Putin, Mark is speaking about Putin, but the emphasis and substance is on these long-standing historical trends, these structural moments of this historical path dependency. If we are to take this rebuilding of the Russian Empire, the support of the Russian population for these sorts of trends, either through nostalgia or through the questioning of the propaganda they get through the textbooks and the the doubling down and kind of this broadening mission of restoring this great Russian nation. And what traps me there, though, is our emphasis on Putin's action. So, I talked to my grad students about, well, is it structure? Is it agency? So I want to kind of ask you guys this, is it structure or is it agency? If we had a different leader, would we have the same outcome? Putin came to power, it seems to me, through accident, right? Yeltsin doesn't want to go to jail. He picks someone who will protect him. Is he picking somebody? Is it incidentally this case? Had Yeltsin picked somebody else, Nemtsov maybe, would we have an entirely different result, which kind of questions then this role of public opinion and this role of nostalgia and this role of this imperial largesse that we seem to be returning to from the Tsarist period? Or is this something that is much more powerful and Putin is just a pawn of this larger framework? I guess this is a question for all of you. And I don't know who would like to take it on first. Either I'll call on Marlene first or I'll call on whoever volunteers. Since Marlene, you went first on the speeches, so.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's probably both, right? I think there are structural feature that would have been there even without Putin himself. There would be pressure, there would be the Siloviki culture, there would be a grassroots society in the 90s that was much more conservative than was the regime was at that time. So these elements were there. I think the combination would have been maybe different. There would have been maybe more resistance if it would have been a leader that would have been maybe more liberal, but Putin was pretty liberal and optimistic in the early 2000s. So I think the chronology also matter, right? It became another country. He himself became another man. The country changed. We changed on our side also compared to the optimism we also had at the beginning, right? So I'm not sure another man, there would be some nuances, but I'm not sure. And also, I mean, if you say it's structure and that would have been the same with another man, it's also look very kind of fatalistic, like Russia will never make it, which I think is also wrong. I think there was a succession, it's a sedimentation process. There was a succession of turning point that once you took it, you kind of closed down the chance of changing the future, of having an alternative future. And then gradually, the country, both by structural feature, combination of elite, and sometime Putin himself closed down alternative future up to the last one, which is like the pure military conquest. So maybe the war, like the February 24, 22, whatever we want dates, is Putin himself. But a lot of things are just things that I think he's carrying and trying to translate. That said, I think on some ideological element, we can see his own personal touch. For example, on the white rehabilitation, is on his anti-Lenin statement, it's very his own personal opinion and not the one of the regime, right? So I think sometimes we can see himself, we can see him, but globally, I think it's this kind of mix of both him, the elite, and then the kind of the world structure. Mark, I give you the floor.
Okay, well, I guess I would say that today the regime is Putin to some extent. He defines what it is. But nevertheless, it's not just Putin. I think it's a larger group of and sentiment that's there within parts of the Soviet elite, and that Putin has evolved over time. And he's not necessarily the same Putin who was there prior to 2011, for instance. And prior to 2014. So I think, he did express his nostalgia for the Soviet Union, in the early 2000s, but, what he's doing now is so far different than that, although it does show that there was always, from the sort of after a short period of time after the collapse, there was always a desire to extend Russian control over this area that they once directly controlled. So is it structure and agency? I think there is a structural element to it. As I said, I think all overland empires actually faced this kind of problem. The Tsarist Empire faced this problem of where do you, or after it collapsed, its successors faced this problem of where do you define the boundary? And that was settled through wars and, attempted invasions in Finland and Poland and elsewhere. So it's not like, what's happened in the collapse of the Soviet Union is unique in history. It's been reflected in other cases. But I think you could look at the examples of other cases, Ethiopia, China, other sort of overland empires. It's just very difficult for them to define their borders, and usually that is a violent process. However, Julie, you said one thing that, okay, Soviet in action, but Russian in ideology. It's not Soviet in action, actually. That's what I was trying to say in some ways. That is
I meant
the
it's
Soviet
strategy. I understand.
strategy. It wasn't Soviet in strategy, or it started off as Soviet in strategy, right? Started off as Soviet in strategy, and there still is some of that element left, but certainly the invasion of Ukraine is not Soviet strategy. I mean, in fact, as Marlene said, Putin openly rejects Lenin. He says, Lenin's to blame for Ukraine being an independent entity. It shouldn't. He made a mistake. So that kind of self-determination is not part of Putin's vision now as a way of structuring control. That just isn't there.
It's full subjugation. You're right. I mean, you did say, this is the failure, both the
The
attempt
failure
and
of that
the
more
learning
Soviet
from it.
model where you would sort of control through either creating a unit that seems to represent somebody, a particular ethnicity, or exercising control over nominally sovereign states like they did in East Europe. I mean, that was the Soviet strategy of imperialism. So,
Peter, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I think structures are much more important than individuals. So that obviously the individual plays a key role at certain conjunctures. And I'm thinking about, the trajectory of Dmitry Medvedev, who was never in the KGB, who was a lawyer, who was eating burgers with Obama, and now he's more rabid than Putin in condemning Ukraine. And so he's responding, presumably, to the structural constraints and opportunities that he sees. Likewise, Sergei Kirienko, another former banker who was seen as a liberal in the late 1990s, was prime minister for a while. He's also head of Rosatom and really hardline on the occupied territories of Ukraine. So you look at the political elite, and Putin is not alone in embracing the imperial state building, unfortunately.
Can I just add one point that is in fact in the Q&A by Ron about the role of NATO and like putting the West into the picture of what Russia and Putin himself has become also. I know it's a very difficult polarizing question, but the role of the West in also creating the Russia that we have, right, is also something we have also evolved on over these last 20, 30 years. So I think here also there can be the man, the structure, but there is also the interaction, right? Russia is not taking decision alone. It's taking decision in a dialogue or a conflict with the West. So there is also, we should also have the West somewhere in the picture as part of the discussion.
Well, let me pick up on that because we have a question. The first question that was asked in the chat in the Q&A is to Mark, and is wondering about the language of neo-imperial control, which he understands to be like kind of this Soviet strategy versus the failure with the tactic towards neo-imperialism, which is like this full-on conquest a la 19th century Russia. But Ulrike from Germany is wanting to know, what does that term really mean when you think about kind of the global element to it, the global alliance that is supporting Ukraine? What does it mean in terms of it, us understanding it as a periphery of this neo-imperial space as opposed to a different part of a different alliance? So Mark, I'm just going to toss that one to you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, as I said, I think neo-imperialism is different than imperial. It's control through what are widely considered to be legitimate structures like self-determination, sovereignty. These are structures. So it's a way of kind of masking control. So how do we understand that? And I think the bigger issue is how do we understand this in terms of the global and the shift? And of course, what's happening, the other thing that's happening is the expansion of Europe, which is cutting severely into this attempt by Russia to recreate some kind of structure of control. There's no doubt that Russia had aspirations to exercise control over its former lands. And that hasn't really died. But what has happened to some extent is that Europe has encroached into this area in ways, and it's not just Europe, China also coming in from the other side. And a lot of that just has to do with, what are the limits to what Russia can offer these states? Yes, there's still oil. Some of them are oil states, can't offer much to them, but it does offer stability to a dictator. Did that in Kazakhstan, but the bargain isn't always bought into by people. The dictators themselves. It took a while for a real direct threat for Lukashenko to totally buy into it. He was playing both sides for quite a long time. And now the Russians know they'd have to cement him in there in a big way. So, yeah, I think that, it's not just about Russia and the expansion of Russia. It's also about Russian aspirations and the growing, or the lack of appeal of that to many. I mean, you look at Nagorno-Karabakh, and so Russia. A lot of people said, "Oh yeah, Russia's going to benefit from this war in Karabakh. It can control both sides." Absolutely not. Absolutely not. The problem for Russia was it couldn't control both sides. It had to pick a side, and of course, it's ensconced in its own war at this point in time. It couldn't come to the defense of Armenia. Besides, even so, Azerbaijan is a powerful, oil state. So the contradictions of that have ultimately left Russia out of an area that it once exercised, considerable control. Georgia also, I think, Georgia, it played with the ethnic conflicts there, and it tried to utilize them and instrumentalize them. But I do think that it ultimately, I mean, clearly it's trying to exercise some kind of informal control, but I think it's lost a lot of its influence, in Georgia. So and Moldova is a whole nother story, where it's tipped in a significant way against Russia. So it's contracted in partially because of the contradictions that are out there in the post-Soviet space, but also because other forces are moving in and have more to offer. The only thing that Russia has to offer is security for a dictator.
So I'm going to try to combine. Oh, there are a lot of very interesting questions. So here's a question then for Marlene, and then I'm going to try to combine some of the more complex ones to kind of shorten it up, so we're not taking them one at the other. But Olga Malinova has asked a question about, the Soviet past and like what the nostalgia is for. And she's pointing out that, part of the Soviet past is about internationalism, about pacifism. And that was part of the messaging as well. And the implication here is that they've been set down and in favor of some different sorts of elements of that Soviet message. So the question is, why is it that it's emphasizing one component of that Soviet mystique versus the other?
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think the regime can pick and choose what it needs from the Soviet tradition to adapt to. So it's of course a usable past, right? You take the elements you need and you put aside the one you don't need. but I think in the population, from what we can know, from since February 2022, I think there have been many people who have been shocked by the war precisely in the name of a kind of internationalism or maybe the pacifism, never the war again, and so on. So I think for some generation, for some social group, it's something that is kind of creating cognitive dissonance for them. And the way the regime is trying to bypass that is to say that, well, it's the West attacking and not Russia attacking. And so that the kind of the discursive way of shrinking that aspect of Soviet memory. So for me, it's a very kind of, pick and choose a strategy. But what I think is fascinating now is with this kind of attempt to present Russia, the global South power in line with the global South against the West. It's all this revival of the Soviet tradition of anti-imperialism. So we can see clearly now more and more kind of leftist narratives arriving about social justice, world social justice, the golden billion and so on. So all these elements of that were already there before, but that are now getting really structured by the regime as part of the new identity of Russia talking to the global South and presenting itself against the leading power against Western imperialism. And I think that for our global discussion, it's really something interesting to also see the global South reaction, right? Which is very much, okay, Russia may be an empire, but it's a regional empire. The US and Europe were world empire, right? So if in your own political culture, you probably, if you are outside the post-Soviet region, your imperial problem were coming not from Russia, but from the West. So I think there is an interesting way of an interesting kind of fascinating paradox of schizophrenia happening now on playing this reviving this Soviet anti-imperial element.
Mark, did you want to add to that?
I agree. I think that Marlene hit it on the head. So it is this interesting phenomenon of sort of playing the global as well, particularly trying to utilize, the global South against the West, while at the same time, of course, connecting with the far right in the United States. And so you have this incredible syncretism that's there. I don't know. I mean, I find contemporary Russia in some ways much more dangerous than the Soviet Union on a global level. I know it's not in some ways, perhaps not considered that by many, but I think the combination of a capitalist economy, a hydrocarbon funded state, a state that does try to manipulate and influence domestic politics kind of directly, and that's mucking around in Africa and many other places. I think in some ways you could say Putin's more successful than the USSR ever was. Maybe not. It doesn't have the same ideological tilt to it, but he has expanded Russian power globally.
Well, I just want to make a quick announcement. There's a hand up in the room. And so we're taking all questions via the Q&A box. So Alexei Savchenko, if you don't mind, if you could please type your question into the Q&A box, and then I'll put it in my clustered queue to pass on to the panelists. And so that's how we structure the Q&A. I wanted to come back, Marlene mentioned the Global South, and there's a question from Paul Good, who wants us to kind of zoom out a little and ask about the international dimension of Russia's kind of international policy broadening out to the Global South, to efforts that it's taking. I'm putting some words in Paul's mouth here, in Africa, for example, and then the response of the Global South to the war in Ukraine, which is very critical of Western hegemony, and views the Western action there is kind of another hand of Western imperialism, as opposed to seeing it as neo-Russian imperialism, as we might say. What are your insights on that? How do you guys view that line of thinking? Is this another remnant of Soviet, or sorry, Russian Putinesque Russian imperial kind of narratives coming to fore in other places? Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, I think the picture is quite complex. It's not straightforward. I think if you look at opinion surveys in Latin America, there's not much support for Russia. There's more sympathy for Ukraine. Even in South Africa, which has been, a leader in the Gaza war, international leader, but also in supporting Russia's position. In South Africa, it's more the elite who are the old ANC cadres who are pro-Soviet, pro-Russian, and the ordinary population are more sympathetic to Ukrainian cities being bombarded. So I think that the picture is quite complex. And if you turn to China or India or the Gulf states, who are the main beneficiaries of Russia's diversion of trade from Europe, the oil going to the Gulf, including to Saudi Arabia and to Indian refineries and to China, that's pure pragmatism. I mean, there may be some residual Soviet nostalgia in some of the diplomatic military leaders in India and China, but that's not true in the Gulf states. It's pure pragmatic profit making that's driving things. So if the Western sanctions can bite into some of that profiteering, and they'll steer away from Russia in a heartbeat. But the most it's not really a topic to joke about, but one of the more curious aspects of the ideological appeal to the global South is that some Africans are claiming Pushkin as a national African poet because he was 1/8 African, and the Russians did put up Pushkin statues in Kampala and in South Africa as well. So they're pulling whatever ideological levers they can to try to get some kind of resonance. But I think the overall picture is yes, global South generally has not supported Ukrainian side in the war, but it's not a black and white issue.
Well, let me, I'm going to pivot off of this, and I'm going to pull from some of the questions and then add another one that one of Cindy Buckley's questions kind of triggered in me. And this is a question about the role of nationalism. One of the questions Mark is wanting to know, with the framing of, the Ruski Mir as an imperial condition as opposed to a nationalist condition, maybe there's something else to talk about in terms of Russian nationalism. Someone else is asking about the role of the ethno-federal structure, whether this kind of expression is what is generating some of these, the geographical design of the kinds of imperialism that we're seeing, or the kinds of questions that appear to be asking, at least in the non-Ukrainian republics where or states where we have these kind of conditions. You mentioned Transnistria, of course, which is not ethno-federal, but in Georgia, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Nagorno-Karabakh, these are some terms that we're talking of, and those have these nationalist moments. And this is going to be a scattershot series of questions because we have about 12 minutes left. So any of you can pick up on any of these themes. But the third thing that I wanted to draw attention to, Cindy Buckley's asking about grievances, right? And this notion that, the ethno-federal system was designed to divide and conquer it became a way to express grievances. It became a way to respond to grievances. It became a way to foster internal dissension inside independent countries that the Russians would have liked to control. Now we also see some sort of moments of concerns inside of looking at Cindy's question in terms of reactions on the Lithuanian border and some closures and some other things in the Baltics, which is a kind of a continuation on the same theme. But then I'm also wondering, does this lead us to turn our attention away from those grievances? And it seems to me, especially as a scholar of Georgia, it's so easy to ignore the very real concerns of the Abkhaz and the South Ossets because at least for the Georgians, for those observing it, because they see this Russian imperial hand and then can ignore those interests on the ground. And so doesn't this become a way for us to ignore more grievances as opposed to resolve them? So that's a lot. That's a scattershot of 3 different things on our Q&A and then my own wrinkle added in. But feel free to pick up on any of those themes. Mark, I'm going to call on you first because it started off as a question to you. And then we
nationalism.
Yeah.
So I think one of our misconceptions about imperialism is that it's not national. I mean, or that there's not a nationalism that underpins it. Nationalism is a very, multifaceted phenomenon, as ASN members should know, and it applies itself to towards various objects. And imperial nationalism has always been one of the driving forces of imperialism. That is, you can trace it back if you look at the British Empire, and that imperialism actually ended up being or I should say British nationalism, to the extent that exists as a phenomenon, was about the British Empire. Of course, when that fell apart, then Britain began to break apart. So a nationalism is is not necessarily in contradiction with imperialism. So Ruski Mir, that's a national understanding. Although, is it? I mean, in what sense? What's the Ruski Mir? What is it made of? Is it language? Is it, orthodoxy? It's so many different things that can potentially be there and be folded out when necessary. But it does have, a cultural content to it. It's not just, empty. So I'll leave it at that because I think, others might want to chime in.
Go ahead,
if
Mark.
I can make just second on what Mark said about imperialism also having a nationalist feature, and I think that's very much the way the Russian system think of itself, right? It's concentric circle, right? So you have several ways of belonging to the whole. There is one core, and then there are kind of circles around, and so that's how the regime or Putin, for example, in his speeches can both say that, okay, we are fighting in Ukraine because Ukrainians are part of Russia, but Russia are part of Russians. But Russia is a multinational state, so it's totally okay and even very good to have Buryat and Chechen dying in Ukraine for this kind of definition of the triune Eastern Slavic nation, right? So I think we tend to we want to categorize and put in boxes and hope that they are very clear boundaries, but they are not, because it's the matryoshka or the concentric circle, right? So Ukrainians have to join the core of this ethnic Russian, whatever it means, but Russia itself is bigger than that. And so when you have a lot of this kind of overlapping or gaps between identities, and I think that's where it can be both kind of imperial and nationalist, and Russian mir, Ruski mir can have many sense, can overlap with Eurasia, sometimes it doesn't overlap. So of course you have also purely kind of semantic games happening around this notion that are operationalized politically, but there is also this idea that all that is pretty flexible. What is the core is the legitimacy of the state, right? It's the statism or the state-centric vision that then put all the different boxes together into, so it's a pyramidal hierarchy, right? Which is, I realized the key element.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go on, no.
Oh, I was just going to say, I didn't address Cindy Buckley's question. Hi, Cindy. How are you doing? So, and I think we should all, to some extent, because, Russia, when Russia tries to extend its influence, it does so on the basis of some social base, right? It's not totally absent. A social base for it is not totally absent. Just like most states, when they do extend, they try to look for social bases. So the problems that are there, often real, often, even though they are real, magnified by Russia in order to instrumentalize them. That becomes a clear vehicle through which Russia can extend its influence. So I don't think that, I mean, I think you're right. And dealing with those issues is the best way to try to securitize your state. Anyway.
Thank you, Mark. Peter, did you want to add on the theme of nationalism?
Well, but of course, within the Russian Federation itself, they've been stripping away rights of ethnic minorities in the school system, the Tatars and Bashkirs. So I think the overall trajectory of Russian policy is moving away from a Soviet-style, as is what Mark Beissinger was saying earlier, is moving away from Soviet-style recognition of ethnic pluralism and collective rights towards a much more monolithic, state-oriented loyalty to the state, and that's expressed through the Russian language. So I think that that's not good news for the 20% or so of the Russian Federation's population that are not ethnic Russians. It's not good news for the 10 million or so migrants, mostly from Central Asia, who are living in Russia and not having particularly good civil rights protection. So, we haven't talked much about Central Asia, I think, which is important because that would be another domino to fall. And there was that remarkable, Russian military intervention in Kazakhstan just before the invasion of Ukraine, and then they pulled out very quickly. So it's a very complicated, dynamic situation there that, again, we can't afford to just turn our back on Central Asia and assume that because Russia has not shown interest in trying to recolonize the area in the recent past, that Putin might not wake up one day and decide it's time to replay the 19th century conquest of the Khanates. And there was a question in the Q&A about settler colonialism. I think yes, the Russian Empire was a settler colonial empire, and there was a conference on that very topic at Yale last year, but that kind of conceptual frame has not percolated through into mainstream Russian studies as much as it probably should.
Thank you, Peter. I'm just going to ask one more question, and it's an amalgam question, and I want to apologize to all the Q&A folks posting. We don't have enough time to get to all your very good questions, so we're gonna post them so that people can see them live, but we're not going to necessarily address them unless they fall into this final question, and that is this. There's a question about what is the future, and so I guess we could end with some very, very careful predictions, with the understanding that we lack both crystal balls and time machines to actually come in with evidence as opposed to hypotheticals. There's what is Putin? What is the end game for Putin? Taking into also, Peter Rutland's remark about the fact that anything could change because that this geography, and just taking Mark's point about the Russian Empire, the geography of the Russian Empire is quite broad, and so that means there are a lot of options for next steps. But what happens after Putin? He is mortal. There's a comment in here talking about already we can anticipate that there is dissension amongst the oligarchs who privately express their dissatisfaction with the current condition. How is this to end in terms of the Russian regime and this Russian neo-imperial experiment? Will it die with Putin, or will it continue?
Marlene, why don't you start, because you had
Marlene,
the first presentation.
No pressure at all.
Yeah. Well, I think probably among the elites you have both. You have people who wish to have a Putinism without Putin, or Putinism after Putin, and hope they can have the regime surviving because it's beneficial for them once the leader will have left. So keeping some of the elements, or a large part of the elements, even if the leader has changed. And then you have probably a part, but I wouldn't consider, I mean, the oligarchs are a very specific part of the elites, right? They are not the bureaucratic elites who would like to go back at business as usual, but this business as usual is still Putinism. It's just early Putinism, right? It's the Putinism of the 2000s where, you know, things were improving in Russia. Russia was becoming part of a globalized economy. And so it's what I call the kind of happy Putinism, you know, happy years of Putinism. So I still think that it's very difficult at the elite level to imagine a regime that wouldn't be Putinism in one way or another. At best, it's the early Putinism. At worst, it's the war Putinism or just the pre-war Putinism. But imagining something totally different is very difficult because the only model that come in mind would be Yeltsin, and that's not very attractive except for a very small minority. And imagining something that wouldn't be Yeltsin, early Putinism, or war Putinism is very difficult, right? I think both for the population and for the elite. So it's also mean it's the future is open. That should be, I think, the main conclusion is that things can change maybe sometime faster than we imagine, even if we have structural elements staying for long. Stopping here.
Thank you, Marlene. And thank you for your presentation, Mark.
Yeah, so what's Putin's end game? Well, the presidential election is part of it. And certainly I'm not talking about the Russian presidential election. I'm talking about the American presidential election. And, you know, if things go right, he could leverage, you know, very significant gains. So, and the breakup of NATO, which of course is a major goal of Putin. So, I mean, I think we need to think a little more openly about possibilities that might be there. But his end game, I think he, you know, he was burnt by the invasion pretty significantly. And the Russian army, you know, showed a level of incompetency that really only hurt Russia to a large extent and hurt Putin. I don't think he's going back to take over Kiev, but I think he's going to wants to swallow somewhat more. And you know, if you look at maps, Kharkiv, parts of Kharkiv are certainly potentially on the table. There's taking over the rest of the territory that of the oblasti that you know, he had originally claimed as part of Russian territory. So I think that there's more potentially to be taken. And then after Putin, I believe that you can't substitute for Putin. He is the linchpin of the system. And once he goes, there's going to be extensive elite conflict. And that makes things totally unpredictable. We really don't know how things are going to unfold. Will Putin leave a legacy of desire for of this types of policies? Yes, definitely. But those are not the only actors who are out there. And often, as we know, you know, if we go back to the Soviet case, you know, successors define themselves vis-a-vis their predecessors, and they often try to shift some of the blame for the situation on their predecessors. So I suspect that once somebody does emerge, and who knows what that process will involve, once somebody does emerge, they will dissociate themselves from some of the things that Putin has done.
Thank you, Mark. Peter, you have the last word.
Great. Well, this was a war of choice by Putin, not of necessity. Wars are incredibly destructive, dumb things. Even if you're winning the war, it can be very costly to your society. I don't see great enthusiasm for this war in Russian society in the long term. So hopefully the post-Putin leadership will come to their senses and stop trying to replay 19th century Tsarist expansion. So that's the most optimistic take I can put on things.
Thank you, Peter. With that, I'm going to draw us to a bit of a close. Zsuzsa Chergo will see us out with some final words as director of the virtual ASN. And thank you guys so much for such a very interesting and intriguing discussion. I wish we had another hour and a half to do it because I have so many more questions, but thank you guys so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Julian. I was even suggesting that I shouldn't be coming back so that we can use all the time for the discussion, because it's been so rich and really wonderful, addressing all kinds of big questions, also theoretically big questions, and including a question that especially Mark brought up and made me thinking that we should have a separate discussion on that, on imperial nationalism, and how much of the literature on nationalism has actually missed that when we've been portraying and teaching about nationalism as something that succeeds imperialism, and forgetting that the first nation builders were simultaneously building empires, and that was one big reason why they became successful in creating those nation states. And so all of that has all kinds of bigger implications as well. So thank you so much. This was terrific. And thank you everyone for joining us and being here. And I want to remind everyone that we are videotaping and archiving these conversations. And so if you log on to the Virtual ASN website, you will find them. You can download them. You can use them for teaching, for thinking more about these questions, and see you next time. Thank you. Take care.